Chapter 3: The 2026 EU Budget Negotiation. Extra taxes and common debt. One of the biggest storm clouds on the horizon is the 4.2 billion euro overrun in borrowing costs for the Next Generation EU Fund. The Next Generation EU Fund is a massive, temporary recovery instrument created by the European Union to help member states recover from the economic and social damage caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Launched in 2021 and set to run until the end of 2026, it is the largest stimulus package ever financed by the EU budget. The NGEU is historically significant for one major reason: joint debt. For the first time in history, the European Commission is borrowing money on the global capital markets by issuing bonds on behalf of the entire EU, rather than each country borrowing individually. Because the EU borrowed money collectively, the interest rates have spiked. In 2026, EU taxpayers are being asked to cover a repayment cost that is twice what was originally projected. The fiscal demise. Here is the ugly truth about the connection to the EU's future and the Ukrainian conflict. The EU survival depends on the organized few being able to borrow money together. The precedent. The Next Generation EU debt was sold as a one-time emergency. However, the 90 billion euros 2026 Ukraine loan was meant to be the second step toward a permanent EU tax. Because of the golden toilet and Midas scandals, the frugal nations, Germany, Netherlands, Nordics, are now refusing to authorize any more common debt. Without common debt, the EU loses its primary tool for centralization. The 2026 EU budget has become the primary battlefield about the democratic processes in the EU, and where the fighting back nations, led by the sovereigntist bloc, are clashing over the future of the Union. The provisional agreement for the 2026 budget, set at 192.8 billion euros, was finalized on November 17, 2025. However, the negotiations revealed a massive sovereignty revolt that suggests the notion that certain countries and political entities are fighting back against the centralized tendencies and the loss of local national sovereignty.
In the European Parliament debates this December, MEPs explicitly cited reports of corruption, including the golden toilet scandals and undeclared luxury cars among Ukrainian officials, as reasons to stop the flow of unconditional aid. The EU responded by adding stricter anti-fraud benchmarks to the 2026 budget, but skeptics argue these are just paper shields. So the scheme is as follows, in simplified terms. Individuals and businesses in the EU pay local taxes. The governments within the EU then pay to the EU coffers. The EU Commission then takes a loan with guarantees in the EU budget and issues IOUs, bonds, to private banks providing the loan. The money then is transferred to Ukraine and disappears. Now the EU owes the private banks for the loan, and in praxis, the Commission hands down the IOUs to national governments within the EU, who in turn passes them over to the taxpayers. So the taxpayers repay the loan plus interest to the private bank. The technocrats look good because they helped Ukraine fight off the Russians. The corrupted elite in the EU and Ukraine get rich. The private bank made a good business, so everybody prospers, except of course the European taxpayer. It is this kind of scheme that could sound like the demise of the EU superstate dream, and the repercussion of the 90 billion euro loan seems to have the potential of being the final nail in the coffin. Repayment issues. EU's officials sold the Ukraine 90 billion euro loan idea to the public with the argument that the loan repayment guarantees were in the frozen Russia assets, i.e. the Russian Federation would be the entity that eventually repaid the loan. The argument is that either A, Russia loses the Ukraine conflict and will be forced to pay war reparations, which will be used to repay the loan, or B, Russian assets will be confiscated and used to repay the loan. This is, however, far removed from the reality and is but a wishful thinking. Russia is actually rather winning the conflict on the battleground, advancing slowly but steadily, grinding down the Ukrainian army in the process. And, as I will cover in a moment, the Kremlin government is currently opening up legal cases against the EU regarding the freeze and the confiscation of the interest earnings of the assets, something that might just be ruled in Russia's favor, which means that the repayment will undoubtedly land on the EU's taxpayer.
This has fueled the Soviet comparison. In Germany and Italy, the narrative is that the Brussels has created a debt trap, where the productive masses are being taxed to pay for the mistakes of unelected, incompetent technocrats and the defense of a foreign state. The masses fight back, budget defiance.